The last thing that we discussed on page 19 was a tshuva from Rav Moshe Feinstein, and I wanted to review a little bit of what I thought was a pretty sensational chiddush here, Rav Moshe, and that is he speaks about cases where you're invited to someone's house and you know they're not kosher, but they claim that they prepared everything for you, they got the right hechsher, and they have disposable utensils. And Rav Moshe says that in certain cases you could actually eat in their house, in their homes. And he speaks about the case where you've tested them over and over again in the past. For example, a father who has, let's say, a daughter-in-law who's not kosher, but she invites him, and every time she invites him, he checks her out, and he sees that she's very meticulous and very reliable. And Rav Moshe said that in such a case, since she has a good track record and you could trust her, she's proven herself over and over again in the past, he says that you can eat from her. And even if she cooks something for you, that was the big chiddush, you could eat from them. So this is on page 19. We'll just read that main paragraph again. On the right column, you'll see on page number 9, Yesh makom lahakel, he says, V'im ha'av yodea, the father knows, V'kimle b'gava, and he knows about his daughter-in-law. She's proven herself in the past. Shelo yachshiluhu be'iser, because she doesn't want to in any way cause him to eat non-kosher. And he has a yediyah brura. It's not like he's surmising it or guessing it or assuming it, but rather he knows it for the fact. Al yedei shenisa osa harbe pa'amim. He tested her many times, like he went in to see where the products were coming from and what the hechsher was on each product, and she batted 1,000. She never missed up on anything. And he says, Yachol lismach aleha, he can rely on her. V'lechol mashem v'ashelos ba'ado, she claims that whatever she cooked and prepared for him was done with all the strict requirements of the Kashrus. V'chol dover she'amru lo shu mevaser mibasar kosher b'kelim shezmina avuro. She ordered special food and special kelim, and he checked her out, and time after time. So therefore, he says that that's considered like a yediyah brura. And yediyah brura in Rav Moshe Feinstein is equal to ne'emonis of an eid echad. The purpose of an ne'emonis of an eid echad is to convince you that this is the reality. It's not midin eidus. In eidus, you need a kosher eid. If eid echad mem bisurim were eidus, then you would require a kosher eid. Not only that, you would require that the eid come into Bezdin, and like any eidus, the Bezdin would interrogate the eid with drishos and chakiros, and then accept the eidus. We don't find that in eid echad mem bisurim. In fact, what we find is that if a shochet slaughters an animal, you're allowed to eat from the animal, even if you heard absolutely nothing from the shochet, because you realize that if the shochet had questions about the kashrus of the shechita, he would have notified you, don't eat from this meat. So we see that we're not talking about ne'emonis, because ne'emonis always requires a statement. Here, the shochet made no statement whatsoever. And therefore, we assume, says Rav Moshe Feinstein, that Eid Echad Neb Bisurin is a question of clarification, of certainty and vados. It's not a question of Eidus. And here we have a perfect example of someone who certainly could not be relied upon in Hilchas Eidus, but yet in Eid Echad Neb Bisurin, you can rely on this person because you have absolute proof positive that what, in this case, she is offering you is kosher. Now, again, Rav Moshe is not excited about setting up situations like that, lechatchila, but he's describing a very sensitive family situation, and he came up with this psak, this kula. And what I found very fascinating about this kula of Rav Moshe is that even though she's cooking for him, once you get to cooking, the sky's the limit, not just talking about packaged food, like you go on an airplane and you get packaged food and it's double wrapped, so it's chasima v'to chasima. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about actually cooked food. She cooks you a meal. And it matters not whether it's a milchika meal or a fleishika meal. But she has special kelim. She designates them for whenever the father-in-law comes to visit. And they're labeled and they're clear, and all the products are coming from a kosher source. All the kelim that they're eating from are reliable. And Rav Moshe says that you can eat. L'chein, b'shas adchak, ulanoshim chalushim yesh lahakim yodea b'birur shekimle b'gava mitzad tivayusa uminhagea b'yezen isyonos shelo tachshiluhu lismoch alev lechol mima shem vashelis. He says, if it's necessary, probably he means shalom bayis, or a weak person who's in that situation where he doesn't have access to food. Again, we're not talking about somebody who's on the verge of starvation, and that would be pikuach nefesh. But nevertheless, he says that if we're dealing with a situation where a person could avoid having to eat at someone's house who's not reliable and is not kosher, and if a person is healthy, then eat in a kosher establishment. But in these circumstances, as the Tshuva of Igros Moshe describes them, he says that there's makom lahak. So that's the last piece that I wanted to add to what we discussed last time. And now we begin something new on page 20. And he speaks about various kinds of labels of kashrus. He's not willing, on the bottom of page 20, which is the last part of the page, he's not willing to tell you a list of which symbols of kashrus are reliable. But he says the following. Number one, that kashrus has to be under the supervision of what he calls Rabbanut Mukeret Umusmechet. You have to know that this kashrus is coming from a rabbinic body that is well known and reliable. And that applies both in Eretz Yisrael and in Chutz La'aretz. So that's number one. And therefore, just because you see a fancy symbol and a fancy printed name on a package or whatever it might be, that's not enough. You have to know and be familiar to identify that kashrus symbol. Number two, he says that today it's very common to have these, he calls them shemos gedolim. They pump it up. They tell them, oh yeah, this is kosher, but you've never heard of them. You don't know what rabbinic board they are. Don't rely on them. Then on page 21, he has what's called Mo'etzet HaRabbanut HaRashit. This is the chief rabbinate. Hichriz al gufei kashrus shenitan lismoch lehem. They have produced a list of those boards of kashrus that are reliable. And therefore, even though you don't recognize, you're not familiar with that particular kashrus symbol, but if it's on a list that's been publicized by the chief rabbinate, then you can rely on that. He wants to be more careful when you go into a restaurant or ulam smachot, or some sort of wedding hall. And he says the hotels, in this case, he says you're not able to see the packaging and the kashrus symbol on every item that's being served to you in the hotel or in the restaurant. Therefore, you have to guarantee that there's a mashgiach, and the mashgiach is reliable, and he's a Yirei Shamayim. Now, again, how do you know that a mashgiach is a Yirei Shamayim? He says, Marachitzoni, don't rely on what he looks like on the outside. He's got a zakon, he's got a very aruch zakon, a very long beard. That's not enough. That's not a proof to rely on someone in kashrus. You have to discuss the issues with the mashgiach. This is what my wife and I try to do if we have to eat in a restaurant we've never eaten there in the past. We ask to see the mashgiach, and we sort of, in a mild sort of way, very sensitively and inobtrusively, we test the mashgiach. And we ask him, where does he get the meat from? He may come out with a package of meat that has a reliable hechsher. We may ask him about checking for bugs, which Mitzvah Hashem will talk a little bit about later on. We may ask him about Trumas and Meisers. Sometimes we'll ask him about Shemitah during the Shemitah season. And therefore, in these cases of restaurants and hotels, make sure there's a mashgiach that's reliable. He's a Yerush Hamayim. Or alternatively, if there's a Tudat Kashrut, then you don't even have to ask for a mashgiach. You can rely on the Tudat Kashrut as a signature and check it out to see if it covers the dates from such a time to such a time. And he says, be careful after Pesach, because after Pesach, you have to make sure that the enterprise sold its chametz. Otherwise, you might be getting involved in chametz ha'avralav ha'pesach. He says, bayesh levakesh mimaracho reshut lafrish. Oh, okay. So now he gets the case where you've been invited to someone's house, and you know that, again, this is more for here in Yerushalayim than in Toronto, but it could be relevant even in Canada. But in Eretz Yisrael, for sure, it's always relevant. You get invited to someone, and you have reason to believe that he's not careful about being mafresh, trumas, and maisros. Now, there's the ideal, the best thing that you could do in that situation, and the b'diavad situation. The ideal situation is that you want to be mafresh, trumas, and maisros on behalf of the balabayis, and therefore you're saving everyone at the table, the entire household. It's not enough to be mafresh from your plate, that which he serves to you or is given to you. You want to be mafresh on behalf of everyone. But the problem is that the Mishnah in Masechta Trumas in the 5th parak says, Chamisha lo yitromu, vim tarmu ein trumas and truma. And one of the trumos afroshas, which is not valid, is that torem shalacheret, eshe'enu shalo. The only way that you can do a valid afroshas trumas and maisus of someone else's payros is if that person gives you reshus. And you may be embarrassed to ask him for reshus to be mafresh trumas and maisus. It's sort of like you're being matel sfekis and chashosh on his kashrus. Or alternatively, it could be that he opposes trumas and maisus. See, that's not his thing. So therefore, you cannot do the ideal, which would be a first choice, to be mafresh with reshus of the bailim, and therefore save the entire household. So therefore, what happens if lo kibla reshus or balabais misnagi lafrosha? This is number 13 on page 21. He says, in such a case, you have to be mafresh for yourself on that plate of food that you're eating from. And, we'll soon see the exact nusach of hafrosha, but it becomes problematic on Shabbos. So on Shabbos, it's a little bit more complicated because tevel that has not yet been subject, hafrosh trumas and maisus, is muktzah. So the question is going to be, how do we circumvent the problem of muktzah? And now we're going to look at number 14. He says, Haboyim lisareach b'Shabbos b'bayish esofigim hifrishu bo trumas and maisros. So you're a guest at someone's house, and you have doubts whether they were mafresh trumas and maisros. And lo nidna reshus, lahafish. The Baal Bayis did not give you permission to be mafresh. And now we introduce another concept which is called T'mai. T'mai means that we're not sure whether or not Trumas and Maisu were taken off. Let's say you buy out there in the marketplace, Truma, Tvua, Peros, whatever it might be, or you go to Shuk Machne Yehuda, and you're not sure if they were mafresh Trumas and Maisu. There's no Tudat Hechsher. You have what's called T'mai. And the Rabbanu were machmer in T'mai, and they require you to be mafresh Trumas and Maisus in the case of Sofek. So he says, in such a case, you do a T'nai. And this T'nai, which means a conditional statement, is going to solve the problem of Hafrosha. Again, it's not going to solve the problem of Hafrosha for everyone at the table, because you don't have Rishus from the Bailim, but as far as that Mana Ishit, your own personal, what's the word? Mana is what they give you to eat. What would you call it?
Responsibility?
No, mana is the that which is on your plate that was given to you. That's called your mana.
Individual portion.
Portion. Okay, we'll call it a portion. And he says the following: on Shabbos and Yontif, he's got to do a T'nai. And let's assume it's T'mai. We don't make a brach on Hafrosha's T'mai because it's a Sofek. But Hayosvi also Taltil Truba o Trumas Maser b'Shabbos v'Yontiv. What are you going to do with the Truma Maser after you've mafresh it? It's Muktzah. Yesh la nichon bimkomon, and he should do it even before he recites the Hafrosha. Because once he recites the Hafrosha, as we'll soon see the Nusach of Hafrosha on page 21, then he's got a real Muktzah Shaila. And he won't be able to move even the Keli because that becomes a bosses l'dover aser. In any event, so he already separates, he takes a certain portion that he's going to designate as Truma Masa, he puts it in a separate plate, so that anything that's left on his plate is already misukan, it's already after Tikkun. And he recites the following Nusach Hafrosha as a T'nai. Now, he says that this Nusach Hafrosha should be recited if all things are equal on Erev Shabbos or Erev Yontif. Because every kind of Hafrosha means that we designate something for the Kohanim or for the Leviim. We don't give it to the Kohanim Leviim today, but nevertheless, it's a kind of Hakno. We don't make Kinyanim on Shabbos. So the ideal situation would be to be mafresh with a T'nai on Erev Shabbos or Erev Yontif. And what is the T'nai? He says, Hayos. Now, let's just make the following introduction. Today, in Eretz Yisrael, it's very common to gain membership in what's called Keren HaMasros. And they charge a pittance. Once you're a member of Keren HaMasros, then all you have to say is, Yehei mechulol ala pruta b'matbea miyuchedes l'chil ze b'keren. L'fi t'noya keren. The Keren, this organization, has already designated on your behalf a pruta, and you just declare that all the trumas and mice that are being mafresh are on that matbea that was designated for me on my behalf by the Keren, and you don't even have to formulate the entire nusach with the T'nai, just according to the conditions of the Keren. That's all you have to say. But let's say you're not a member of the Keren. Hayoser mi'echad u'mea, so you have, let's say, 100, and you want to give truma. Truma is, according to the rabbinic law, let's say 2%. But you don't have to give 2% because chita achas potes kli, it's enough to give a mashu. But more than 1 over 100, mimashani asid lahafresh. Why does he add the phrase asid lahafresh in a Tanai kind of way? Probably what he means to say is that he doesn't want to make it truma right now because everything is mixed up together, and he'll leave himself room to decide exactly what's going to be truma. Now, you'll ask me, this depends upon something called brera. And the brera is a sugya all of a shas, but we're going to avoid the problem of brera through what's called Tanai. Tanai is a way of circumventing brera. So more than 1 over 100 that I will be mafresh should be truma gedola. And he designates that he's going to take it from tzad safon, from a certain side of the portion that's in front of him. Then he goes ahead and he says that with regard to the remainder of the food on his plate, is tisha chalakim kemoso b'tzad tzfonish shel haperos yemaisa rishon. I'm adding another 9 portions, the same size as that 1%, to jack it up to 10%, and that should be masa rishon. Then he needs what's called trumas maser. Every maser is tevel l'truma, so you have to take off another percentage from the maser. So he says also echad mimea shisnesi she maser ye trumas maser. So 1 out of 100, according to my stipulation of the maser rishon, will be given as trumas maser. Okay, fine. He's got, he was mafresh already truma gedola. He was mafresh trumas maser. Now we're up to maser sheni or maser oni, depending upon what year of the Shemitah cycle is. So, for example, now we are up to maser sheni, and next year likewise, and then 3 years from now will be maser oni. So what does he do? He says that Maser Oni Bidromo Shel Peros, that's on the south side. Yemechul Hu V'chom Shel Pruta. So Maser Oni could either be given to the Oni in the form of Peros, or alternatively, you can transfer it over to Mos. So he's going to transfer it over to Mos. So he's going to designate, if he's not part of the Keren, as we said before, designate a certain coin for Maser. Okay, these are complicated halachas. Then let it be a matbea for chil maser sheni, maser oni, maser oni bidromo, etc., etc. Okay. So let's say he is a guest at someone's house. He can salvage and solve the problem of maser, but now he has another problem. He believes that the kalim that are being served, on which the food is being served, have not been subject to tfilas kalim. And he says here, number 15, Hamisareach bebayis shalohutbalu bo klei goyim. So clearly your host has purchased these kalim from goyim, and he was not matbil the kalim. There was no tfilas kalim. Now tfilas kalim is a mitzvah aseh, and it applies to the owner of the kli and to anyone who borrows the kli. So insofar as you're a guest in his house, you're borrowing his kalim, you would be chayav in tfilas kalim, which means you're not allowed to use those kalim and eat from them until you tovel the kalim. If possible, the ideal situation would be that he requests from the Balabayas to present to him his portion of food on, let's say, a disposable kli, or let's say a plastic kli, even hard plastic, but whatever it is, it's not one of those materials which are metals or glass that require tefillah. And that's great. However, what about the following scenario? You have no alternative of getting your food in plastic or disposable kalim. Clearly, your food, let's say, he serves you a soup in a glass bowl or a metal bowl. And he says the following. Rashoy lechos hamugash mitoch yod hos b'ezus mapit. Great news, guys. You ready for this? We got a fabulous cooler. He's allowed to dig his hands into the food and eat from his hands. Now, I was once at a Rebbe's Tish with my father-in-law, may he rest in peace. And right after davening, the Rebbe invited my father-in-law and myself, together with another 8 or 9 people, to a kiddush, and they served gefilte fish. But guess what? They didn't serve it with a fork. Everybody ate the fish with their hands, except for you know who. And the Rebbe said, bring him a gobble, bring him a fork. I felt like the Litvak amongst Hasidim. But it was very uncomfortable for me to eat with my hands. So that's the great cooler that we have over here. It's not going to help you with soup. I don't think you'll be able to eat or drink soup with your hands. And then he has a mapit. So I guess he means by a mapit, if you have a solid substance and you put it onto a
Napkin.
What do you want to call it? A napkin. Is that what you said? A napkin? I meant to say a napkin. And then you take the napkin and you feed yourself from the napkin. Also not a great cooler.
Would you say that using a straw with soup?
That's a great idea if you can get a hold of a straw, and if there's no solid substance in the soup, if it's a clear soup. Now he has a kula, which I'm not familiar with. Rav Yaakov Ariel, I think he's a Rosh Hashiva somewhere in Ramat Gan, if I'm not mistaken. He wants to say, you know what? You can use a kli that doesn't have tefillah on a one-time basis. I don't know, that's a chiddush to me. But now he quotes a sefer, number 16, called Tfilas Kelim, very famous, Reb Tzvi Cohen, I think I have it somewhere. And he says that in the case of an oreach, the guest, is not actually borrowing the kelim. He's not renting them. He has no responsibility whatsoever for the kli, and therefore he has no bailus. So it means that the premise here is that only a bailim who owns the kli, and he has at least some minimum responsibility vis-a-vis the kli, that if it breaks, he'll have to pay compensation. They're not allowed to use the kelim if the kelim were not brought to the mikveh. But an oreach, a guest, has no tzad bailus, he has no tzad achrayus whatsoever, he's part of. Now again, if you're dealing with a drabanan, let's say, for example, a glass plate or a glass bowl, which is only a chiyuv tefillah drabanan, nicha, you could say that in this case that you have no achrayus on the kli, we could be mekil, even though it's not toivel. But if you're dealing with a metal kli, which is a chiyuv doraisa, that becomes very difficult. Now, one of the problems here is the famous Or Zarua. The Or Zarua was one of the Ashkenazic Rishonim, Balei HaTosfos, and he has a hekesh, which we're not familiar with, between Tfilas Kalim and Agolas Kalim. And he says that eating out of a kli which requires tefillah is like eating from a kli that requires hagolah. Very strange. In the case of a kli that requires hagolah, the tam isur that was used by the guy because he cooked whatever treifas he cooked, that's going to be polate and it's going to enter into his food. So you must have hagolah. But in the case of eating out of a kli that's brand new, for example, was purchased from a guy, it was never used, there's no blias isur, but rather Torah requires tahara, that you take the kli and you put it into the mikvah. That's not the same as hagolah. And again, the Ozarua wants to establish that there's a mitzvah doraisa of tfilas kelim. So the author of Tfilas Kalim writes, "La'anias daiti gam l'divrei Ozarua lo mistaber lo m'she kli lifnei tefillah is kemo kli lifnei hagolah. Kli before hagolah is poleit isa, but now we're talking about a brand new kli that was never used by the guy, and it's not poleit isa. There's no blias isa, so it's not in any way analogous to a case of a kli that requires hagolah. Shari also kli bisman shu eitzel hagoy mutal b'shimish l'Yisrael. I'll prove it to you. That same kli that requires tefillah, if let's say the guy would invite you to eat from that kli, you would not require tefillah. So obviously it's not the same as hagolah. Hagolah kolshkein, if you're using the guy's kli, requires hagolah. Is mutar b'shimish l'Yisrael. A Jew is allowed to use a kli that's owned by a guy. In fact, when we get to the toaster, we'll see that some of the heterim for a toaster is to leave the ownership of the toaster in the hands of the guy. Because once you acquire ownership, you're not allowed to use it without tefillah, and tefillah on a toaster is very problematic. If it needs hagol, it's got blias isur. You can't use the kli at all to feed a Jew, even if the kli still remains in the ownership of the guy. Al kochach she'ein kan iser chefts ala kli. In the case of hagolah, where there's a blias iser that is absorbed into the walls of the kli, that's a chefts d'isura. You've got nevela in a form of blias iser in the kli. Here, they're not with regard to the tfilas kelim. You cannot say that it's an isur chefza, because if an isur chefza, then it will be also even before you purchase it from the guy. El gzeres hakosavi shekasher Yehudi kone goy kli mi goy chai betfila. It's all a chiyuv gavra to be tovel a kli, and what generates the chiyuv gavra? Your purchase of the kli. And then Yotzer b'magbil, now that you have an Isa Gavra, the Isa Gavra generates an Isa Chefza. And you're not allowed to use the Kli before you fulfill your Chovas Gavra. Oreach, a guest, if he's not acquiring any sort of achrayus or ownership in any shape or form over the Kelim, eino mitzuva lahat bilas hakli. He doesn't have or share that Chovas Gavra of Tefillah. Is Memela, there's no Isur Chefza. So this is a fascinating idea, even in the language of brisket Torah, to have an Isur Chefza for you, but not for me. So let's say, the owner of the house who owns the Kelim, he's chayiv in Tefillah as a Chovas Gavra, and therefore there's an Isur Chefza. But when he feeds an oreach in those same kelim, that oreach does not acquire a chovas gavra. He's not obligated in being mitayar the kelim. He doesn't own them. He's not responsible. He doesn't have any bilas. And the male is no isur chefza. So it's a relative isur chefza. It's an isur chefza vis-a-vis the balabayis, but not vis-a-vis the oreach. And in my mind, the only precedent to such a thing would be neder, where I can take a neder on this piece of kosher meat, and konam alai b'isa neder, it becomes an isa chefta for me. You want to eat the piece of meat, you're allowed to eat the piece of meat. We lost you, Joe. Okay. So this is pretty fascinating. So the bottom line is, oh, there you are, you came back. So the bottom line here of this discussion is that the Oreach, since he's not chayav in tefillah, he doesn't have that isur chefta of eating out of the kli. Because fundamentally, tefillah's kelim is a chovas gavra. The chovas gavra engenders a chefta d'isur on the kli, but if there's no chovas gavra, there's no chefta d'isur on the kli. And therefore, if you take a look on the top of page 23, he summarizes it very nicely. He says, Oreach eino chai b'tefillas keli. And therefore, he could be somech on this logic that we saw here in the Sefer Tefillas Kelim, that since he's not chayav in Tefillas Kelim, and Mela, there's no Isur Chefta, he's allowed to use the Kelim. Again, I have to emphasize over and over again, all this is under the assumption that there's no Blias Isur in the Kli. It's a brand new Kli, it's never been used. Adam HaMisarech Eitzel Adam Shein Torah Mitzvahs Shalom Achado Lishtos B'Kol Shein Tefula Omer Rabbeinu Shemuta Lishtos. He quotes Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, who says that if a person who's not Shomer Torah Mitzvahs gives you a cup of some liquid to drink, there's no tefillah on the cup, you're allowed to drink from the kos. And again, all this seems to be based on the assumption that the Isur Chefta, the Kli, is engendered by the Chovas Gavra of Tefillah, which doesn't apply when you're simply being given a cup of water to drink. And therefore, he quotes the Shulchan Shlomo, which is Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, and he says that Bakroi b'shasat chakev shelo hakel. Rav Shlomo Zalman is not excited about this, but if it's a shasat chak, he has no other choice, then he yesh lo hakel hol vakel benim shelo ve'en biyad l'tovlam. V'lachein efshe b'chol da lo asru chachavim s'ishtamshus me'aytayim hiter rabbeinu likno shtia b'rechova shel ir. Do you ever think of the problem? People buy, all sorts of drinks, here. I remember this very popular to get carrot juice, where they squeeze the carrots, have this thing, I remember when I was in South Africa, I actually was able to drink strawberry juice. It was incredibly tasty. And there was a hechsher on it. But if, let's say, you're out in the shuk and you watch as they squeeze the oranges or whatever it might be, and then they give it to you in a cup, and the question is, can you use the cup without tefillah? And the answer is that since you don't have the possibility of being tovel the kli, or the Baal Bayis won't let you tovel the kli, or you're not in close proximity to a mikveh to be tovel the kli, then in all those cases, she'ein biyadu l'tovlam, then the Chachamim said, you don't have a chiyuv tefillah, and therefore there's no isur chefta, and there's no isur shtamshus b'kli. And we can also add the discussion about buying pop and things like that. You buy whatever liquids are in a glass. A glass needs tefillah, and you're drinking from the glass, right? From the glass that contains the liquid, and there was no tefillah. He says, "Kasher mishtamish bekelim hamishamshim lagoshas mamon b'makom yud lemischar bilvad." So now he's talking about restaurants where the kelim were designated only for the purpose of, so to speak, renting them out. Meaning, when you come into a restaurant, you're sort of like paying a certain fee, which is swallowed up in the final bill, for use of their kelim. And in such a case, he says that you're not chayiv tefillah. Not only that, I think David just showed up. Anyway, he says that you're not even chayiv tefillah if you own the restaurant. Now, we were talking about the guests and the hosts that are coming into the restaurant, all this clientele. And we were saying, well, they don't have to run around with the kalim and find a mikvah and so forth. But now we're saying that even the owner of the geschäft, the owner of the restaurant, he's not chayiv in tefillah at all. Why is that so? And the answer is, and this is very fundamental, the chiyuv tefillah only applies to what's called klei seuda. Klei seuda are kalim, the function of which and the designation of which is for eating. When the restaurant buys these kalim, it's buying it in order to make a profit, in order to rent it out so that the customers, the clients who come in to eat at the restaurant will pay a certain amount, as we said before, it's swallowed up in the price in the final bill for the use of the kalim. So the owner of the restaurant has no interest in designating these kalim for his suda. He's only using it in the restaurant, and that's called a kli schora. And a kli schora is not chayiv in tefillah. And that's what he has here in the name of the Shulchan Shlomo. And he kilu kevat sheish makom lahachshiv kelim elu ki kli schora v'lo ki kli seuda. Now we're up to number 18 on page 23. And again, we asked about buying, a drink that's, in those machines or whatever it is, and it's in a glass jar. Kone mashkos etzel mozeg Yisrael. Okay, shelo hitvil kela. So one of two possibilities: either you're getting it from a guy, or you're getting it from a Jew, but the Jew is not tovel the kela. Ein choshin leis, no problem. You can drink straight from the glass. Lefisha mozeg atzo potem in adin. Even the owner of the soda pop who owns the kli and it's made of glass, he's not chayiv in tefillah. Why? Kevan shelo knoim, when he purchased them, he didn't buy them to be klei seuda el tzorch mischara lahamtzi mashkos lekuchas. He bought it to make business out of it, to make a profit out of it. And now in number 19, he says, Yesh tzai litain tam la minik shelo tov l'roso lefisha kosvizam di'im lekacho Yisrael eschora v'lo l'shtamish bo im hishel Yisrael acher lo tzor tvila shelo nischayev biyad harisha. Now, what the Shevet Sofer is implying is a question. He doesn't even raise the question explicitly, he just answers the question. And he says the following: I could grant you that the owner of the geschäft is not chayiv in tefillah because he bought it as kli seuda. But now you're using that kli and you have no monetary gain from the kli. You're using it as a kli seuda. Why aren't you chayiv? Even if the Rishon, the owner of the kli, is not chayiv in tefillah, but you, the sheni, are chayiv in tefillah, insofar as for you the kli is a kli suda. And he answers the following: unless you own a kli, the only possibility of being chayiv in tefillah is if the owner of the kli is chayiv in tefillah. That's called nischayev biyad harishon. So, for example, let's say Ruvain buys kalim, and he wasn't tovel them. Now Shimon wants to use the kalim, so it's already nischayev biyad harishon, and therefore the cheft of the kli, he screams out and generates a chiyuv tefillah. But in a case where the Rishon, Ruvain, was not chayiv in tefillah, then Shimon, since he didn't acquire ownership over the kli, does not have a chiyuv tefillah. He says, "B'kleis chuches ta'avi rakter abana yesh lismoch al mechaber ve'haramod lo tzorch tefillah klal." And he says that if it's a kli schora, it's only bought for monetary benefits, then certainly there's no reason to be machmir in a kli zchuchos, which is only dirabban. And this issue about orchim, or clients who come into a restaurant, is addressed here on the bottom of page 23. Kelim shamishtamshim lahagoshas mozon b'mokom amiyuad l'lekuchos o la'orchim bilvad kigon batei malon misadot batei kafeh v'chadome yesh omer shemutarim v'shimish b'lo tefillah. So this is the shita that we've been presenting here in the name of the Darkei Tshuva, the name of the Shevet Sofer. But if you turn to page 24, you'll see that not everyone agrees with this shita, and Rav Shlomo Zalman himself did not accept this shita hook, line, and sinker. V'lo kibel as far as achronim lahachshiv kelim elu kekli schora. Because after all, even the one who owns the restaurant and purchased the kli, he did so for the function of eating, and therefore it's not really kli schora, according to Rav Shlomo Zalman. That's like a legal fiction. It's, let's be honest about it, a kli seuda. Ach im zos kasher ein lo efsharos lahatvil sakelim yochel ishtamish ben below tefillah. If need be, you have those shitas to fall back on, and you don't need to feel. He says, "Le'inyan achila bebate malon, bekelim shel tfulim lo nearly." The tshuva of the Michas Shlomo, Reb Shlomo Zalman, he doesn't agree with this for the achronim lachshivim kekli schora. I don't buy into that. Ulam yesh lahakil b'zel lefi mashkasafti lel de'iser shtamshus ein el d'Rabbanan. And therefore, b'malon v'chadome, he doesn't have the possibility of tvila, sharila. So Shlomo Zalman says the following, that there are two dinim here. There's one din of the chovas tvila, and then there's another din of the iser lishtamesh b'kli without tvila. Are you with me? Let me go over that one more time. There's one basic din that the Torah says that you're required to take a new kli from a guy that you purchased and be tovel. There's another din that as long as you weren't tovel the kli, you're not allowed to use the kli. And Rav Shlomo Zalman says the fundamental difference between the two. The first, which is a chovas gavra to be tovel, that's doraisa. But the second thing, that you're not allowed to be mishtamish with the kli without tefillah, that's only d'Rabbanan. And he says, therefore, since as you are invited to eat at someone's house, or you're eating at a restaurant or in a hotel, here the Isser, even if I grant you that there is an Isser, is only d'Rabbanan. And therefore, we can be mekil based on the svara of those poskim that Lo neschai b'yad rishon, it's klei schora. So we'll only fall back on klei schora, says Rav Moshe, says Rav Shlomo Zalman, because the Iser Ishtamshus b'kli is the Rabban. Are there any questions up till now? I've been talking my head off here. You know? You'll have to unmute yourself, though. Joe, what?
No, the Reb's doing a great job. It just
Do you have it? Anything that needs a little bit review here? Do you see the two approaches to allow you to eat in a restaurant where the kalim weren't tovel? One approach is to say that even the proprietor, the Baal HaMalon or the Baal HaMisada is not chayiv in tefillah, and then we're classifying the kalim that were bought for the purpose of schora as they're not being klesu. The other approach is to say, like Rav Shlomo Zalman's chiddush, that using a kli without tefillah is only d'Rabbanan, And if need be, we'll rely on those mekilim in a case of a derabban. All right.
I always remember the idea of a person who was on a plane, right? If they, I mean, it's not most of these things are not an issue today until they take the plastics completely away from us, anyways. But there was that the food was kosher, everything was kosher, but you didn't know. Again, the utensils were metal, and
that's a no-no.
that you would be able to say you would say no. I mean, everything's kosher, and you would be able to say if you ask the stewardess if you could take the kalim home, and they said no, then that gave you a heter to use them that time because they were not yours. But I mean, according to the first idea, that makes it sense, but not necessarily.
I'm saying the following: that if you were given those stainless steel kalim as a gift, and let's assume you don't have
no, they would say.
No, I'm saying in a scenario where they say take them home.
I'm saying that they would say no, you can't take them.
Oh, if you say fine, but I wanted to just touch on one other point. Let's say they say we don't want your spoon back. It's a souvenir. It's a gift. Then you have a serious problem, because even if you guarantee that there's no blias iser, and if it doesn't require agola to get rid of pleitas iser, but you still have a problem with tevilas kalim, and now you've purchased or acquired, I should say, a metal kli from a guy, and that requires tefillah. Now, according to Rav Shlomo Zalman, you're involved in an Isur Ishtamshus D'Rabbanan, but nevertheless call it a D'Rabbanan, but it's awesome. And you can't call it a Klei Schora because you're not renting it out to anyone else. You're not opening a restaurant with that spoon that they gave. So the best idea would be to either, as you say, clarify that the spoon goes back to them, so you don't acquire ownership. Again, if there are disposables, that's the best way of going. Now, in general, when you're on a plane, you can raise another question. You want to get a coffee, and they take out a metal kli, a kettle of some sort, and they pour you the coffee. So that metal might be treif, but I don't think we assume it's treif. I think we want to assume it's only used for coffee. And then you get into issues like cut up fruit and melons and things like that. You buy, they cut it up for you, they take it off the peel and all that. And you want to know whether the knife that they used was kosher. So, for example, if you buy fish in a non-Jewish store, you have to make sure that the fish has not been cut up into pieces. So you don't want to get skinned fish. And then you have another problem. How do you know the fish is kosher unless the skin is on the fish? So I have no problem with buying fish. They have it on the, on the ice. You know what I mean? You could buy it and it's whole and you see the skin. So it has scales, it's a salmon or whatever it is. And it hasn't been cut. If it's been cut, you really might have serious problems. Unless you have reason, certainty, let's say, beyond the shadow of a doubt that they never used the knife for cutting meat. But I don't know, that's a little bit tricky to be, what are you going to do? You're going to ask the guy, have you ever used this knife? He probably doesn't even know because there are other people who cut the meat. So I don't know. That becomes
there's issues also with regards to, they've talked about this at shul. They brought up the Indian of tefillah. Like, let's say you have like a bottle of pickles with has a hechsher on it, but even if they would have toveled the kli, they had no right. They had bought the kli as a concept of selling it. The halacha of to toivel it, they didn't even have a reshus to do it. It's not in their concept. So when you get that bottle of pickles, if you have any concept, if you have any thought of saving that bottle later on, right, not throwing it out. If you're going to throw it out, right, it doesn't, would you say that it stays with the idea of like disposable, so to speak, if you're going to give it back to recycle anything. But if you planned on using that bottle afterwards, would you say you would have to empty out the pickles, toivel to the bottle before?
So you buy pickles from a manufacturing company. It's not Jewish.
Even well, even if it is Jewish, the bottling company, the manufacturer of the bottles wasn't
right. He wasn't told the jars.
Even if he did, he didn't have a chiyuv of tefillah.
Well, wait a second. If it's a Jewish company and they are producing or purchasing glass, for storing the pickles and selling the pickles, then
glass bottles, yeah.
Get into this whole issue whether or not the glass jars are kli suda or kli schora.
The kli schora, no question, no.
So if they're kli schora, then everybody's okay, because even the Jew who sold you the glass of pickles, he's not obligated in tefillah.
Right, so now you are, right? When you buy it.
I don't think so, because, you mean now you're owning it. But it doesn't matter, you bought it from a Jew. Your question would only arise if you bought it from a guy.
Why is it a kli suda?
I'm saying later on, if you're going to use it later on for something.
But it doesn't matter. It's only chayv in tefillah if it was manufactured by a guy or purchased from a guy. You purchased it from a Jew, and that Jew is not chayv in tefillah.
So once there's
once
there's a Jew in between who didn't have a chiyuv of tefillah, but he was an in-between guy, then the
wait a second. Now you're talking about three Jews. There's Reuben, Shimon, and Levi.
Just two Jews.
Two Jews. Reuben and Shimon. Was Reuben chayv in tefillah?
Reuben wasn't chayv in tefillah because he was.
So then Shimon is not chayv in tefillah. Why? Because Shimon purchased it from Reuben. And if Reuben wasn't chayv in tefillah, then Shimon is not chayv in tefillah.
Okay, so
the only issue would be if you purchased it from a guy. So then, what we would say is that once you want to reuse the glass on a second round, maybe you have to do that would be the question.
That's the question, yeah, exactly.
So on that, we have the famous tshuva of Rav Shlomo Zalman with regard to Hellman's mayonnaise. You have a famous jar in glass, and now you want to reuse it.
Yeah.
So Rav Shlomo Zalman says that when you decide to reuse it, you are now designating it as a kli. It's as if you created the kli, and you, as a Jew, creating a kli are not chayv in tefillah.
Gotcha. Okay.
And this has to do also with like broil and foil and all that stuff. You get a foil pan. It should be chayv in tefillah. You bought it from a goyish company, but the answer is that it's disposable. But what do you mean it's disposable? Now I decided I want to reuse it. It's no longer disposable. But the answer is I created it as a kli. The guy sold it to me disposable, which is not a kli, and therefore it's not chayv in tefillah. I made it into a kli by designating it as a non-disposable kli. Okay, then any other questions before?
So can we talk about a toaster for a second?
Yeah, let's talk about a toaster. There are a number of solutions to the toaster problem. First of all, it's clear that we don't want to recommend tvila on a toaster. That's not a good
So,
thing.
1 second. First of all, let's clarify which toaster we're talking about. Are we talking about the oven toaster? where
No,
you-
no. I was talking about just the bread toaster. Then we
The
could
bre-
talk about an oven toaster.
where you push it down
Correct.
and then, okay.
So you don't want to take that to the mikveh. It's not a good
To start
idea.
with, why is it a kli suda?
Oh, so Rav Moshe says that a kli suda only applies if the food is non-edible. Well, there are two categories. Kli suda would be either a kli that you bring to the table, or a kli that makes the food edible. But if you have a kli that A is not brought to the table, and B is only used for that which is edible, then it doesn't require tefillah. So a kli that's not brought out to the table only becomes chayav in tefillah if it creates an edible food. That itself, the fact that it takes a non-edible food and makes it edible, that itself makes it into a kli suda. So let's say, for example, I have a frying pan and I fry eggs in a frying pan. I don't take the frying pan and put it on my table, but the frying pan makes the eggs edible, unless you're Rocky. Right. I don't know which Rocky. Are they up to number 5 yet? Okay. So that's the heter of Rav Moshe Feinstein for a toaster. And again, a toaster with the 2 pieces of bread, and you push the thing down. The bread is edible even before you toast it. And you don't put the toaster on the table. So mimanavshach, it's not a kli suda. But now, Joe, you raised the issue of a toaster oven, what we call. That's a horse of a different color. There, the poskim write that you should only use a toaster oven that has an insertable tray that can be taken in and taken out, and that you'll have to be toven. Why? Because even though the toaster oven is not put on the table, nevertheless, you use it for making food edible. And that makes it into a kli suda, like the frying pan with the raw eggs. But it's not that the entire structure of the toaster oven is chayav in tefillah, only that part that you can take out and put back in.
The racks. But I once heard a concept that I don't know who it was who gave the tshuva that when you plug it in, that is makabah patish, that you're actually completing the kli.
Correct.
Have you ever heard that?
Be that since it cannot be used without an electric element, then right now it doesn't have a shem kli, and therefore it doesn't require tefillah. You make it into a kli when you put it in the electric element. And others say that if it requires an electric element, then it's called mechuber lekarka, and it's not a kli, because it cannot be used without being connected to the electricity. Okay, we're going to stop here.
Thank you, Rav.
And I'm really going to take this opportunity to wish you a great summer. I think I'm going to call it Ben Azmanim now, after Shavas B'Tammuz. And it's been, it's been really great. So I'm going to use, I have a backlog of many things to take care of. And I'm going to try to use that time, for that.
The Seder, is the Rav, does the Rav have an idea when we could reconnect?
I would say sometime around Rosh Chodesh El. I don't know, I don't have a calendar in front of me, but either a week before Rosh Chodesh El, a week after.
Okay, you'll be in touch.
Correct.
Okay
then.
Shkoyach, Rav, thank you
best.
very much. Have a great time.
Thank you so much.
Easy fast tomorrow and
have a meaningful fast. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Bye-bye.